Alright, so I'm Caitlin, and today I'm going to talk about my journey from being a student to becoming a teacher. This is me when I was little and in preschool and cute, and in the process I upgraded to cardigans instead of those sweet sweaters that you see in right there. But just to give you a little background information about myself, I am from Chatham, Virginia, which is a small town in Southern Virginia. Coming to Virginia Tech was a huge thing for me. It has 20 times as many people as my entire town has, and that was a big decision for me to make, and it was a big deal. But I love small town life. I love everything about it. I love that everyone knows me. I love that I know everyone else. It's really great to have a support system that the small town community can bring to you, and that did translate to my student teaching. Being at Blacksburg, the community is a lot like my community back home. Throughout my life, I always knew that I wanted to be a teacher. From the time I was very, very little. I used to play school with my sister. When I studied in high school, I would lecture to a pretend audience. That's how I learned best. Is talking it through and explaining things is what I knew I was going to be good at, and that I wanted to be a teacher. I just didn't know what and what. I hated school. All through school. I did not like it. On the first day of kindergarten, I got in trouble for talking and had to sit out during our lunch break. And from that point on, I was like, well, this is shot for me. I don't really like this very much. I had a pretty good schooling experience. You know, my classes were good. I love to learn. I still love to learn. That's one of my passions. I love learning new things and being taught new things and learning from other people. But I just didn't like being at school. But I did have a couple teachers along the way. I didn't know what I wanted to teach, even though I knew I always wanted to be a teacher. But throughout my elementary years, I was like, oh, I don't know what I want to teach in. I knew I always liked my history classes, but you know, I didn't know. In 5th grade, real math hit, and I decided I was never going to be a math teacher. So I nixed that one pretty quickly. But then throughout high school, I still liked science okay. Then I made an executive decision to take AP Chemistry, in which then I decided never to be a science teacher. And I loved history. I knew that I loved history. 4th grade, I loved Virginia history. 7th grade, I had an awesome history teacher who really made world history, which can be quite dry and boring, come alive for me. And then in high school, I had a Western Civilization teacher and an AP Modern European History teacher who really just brought the subject alive. And I decided from that point on that that's what I wanted to do. I was going to be a history teacher. I wanted to translate that passion to other students. I wanted them to love the subject as much as I did. And so pretty much every step from elementary school on has been to get me to this point, to this day, in front of everybody. This is what I've always wanted to do, and this is the moment that is probably the biggest in my life up to this point. So, to tell you a little bit about my experience, a little bit about my growth, I will start with the metaphor that we had to write in the fall. And teaching is making a pizza. Not only do I love pizza, but I also love teaching. So I thought it was an appropriate metaphor. And I'm just going to read that out loud. Teaching is making a pizza. It is the chef's job to mix the ingredients to make the dough. It is the teacher's job to mix ingredients to formulate an effective lesson. Next, the chef adds the toppings. Each person likes different toppings on their pizza, just like each student has different ways of learning. It is the chef's job to make those toppings work, and it is the teacher's job to figure out the strengths and weaknesses of their students, so that they can teach their students to the fullest extent. The last step is cooking the pizza. I see the baking of the pizza as letting the contents of a lesson sink in with the students. A teacher should try and teach in a way so that students absorb the information and remember it, just like the pizza dough cooks and the toppings and the cheese stick to it. It is the chef's job to construct a delicious pizza by mixing just the right ingredients. It is the teacher's job to mix the right method so that the students learn, absorb, and enjoy the information. My early field experience in student teaching reinforced this metaphor. It was evident that each student had a different way of learning, and the teacher had to try and effectively teach each student. They had to mix the effective ingredients to formulate an informative and exciting lesson, and one that would resonate with their students. I believe it is important to remember that each student has their own learning style, just like each one has their preference of pizza toppings. And this metaphor really stuck with me throughout my whole student teaching. I learned that not everybody learns like me. I'm an auditory learner. I like to hear people talk. I'm fine in a lecture classroom. It's, I don't mind that at all. But not everyone's that way. And so whenever I felt that I was getting frustrated with a student, I would keep this in mind and I'd say, okay, let me take a step back. Let me think about how I can approach this in a different way so that this student gets the material that I want them to get. Another thing that guided how I wanted to teach is a quote by Albert Einstein: "Everybody's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing it is stupid." And I think that is so true. You can't judge students in the same way. Not every student is the same. They all have different learning strategies. They can't all be assessed in the same way. So I knew with these two things that I wanted to carry them into my student teaching to help me become the best teacher that I could be. But going into my student teaching, I was still a little unsure of how I wanted to teach and what kind of classroom I wanted to set up. I knew I couldn't be a strict teacher. I just don't have it in me to be mean to small children. But I was still unsure about how I wanted to set up my classroom. And I knew that student teaching would be kind of a weird experience too, because it's never really your classroom. You don't have the opportunity. It's not your classroom. You still have a cooperating teacher that you have to work side by side with. So these things I kept in mind throughout my student teaching experience. And in the 100+ hours of work that I put into the portfolio and everything else, it was really difficult for me to sit down and narrow down what I wanted to talk about today. The areas of growth that I experienced and what I wanted to discuss. And I think it's important that my growth as a teacher reflects the students' growth as learners. Everything that I learn, every way that I learn and grow as a teacher will translate to the students. They can learn from me. The more of an effective teacher that I can be, the more likely they are to learn the material. So, one thing that I felt that I really improved on during my student teaching and my observation experience was lesson planning. I was petrified of lesson planning, mainly because we get greeted with this lovely template, and it intimidated me. All of it intimidated me. Doing the NCSS lesson plans intimidated me. And this was it became a great structure, and I loved using this because it helped me so much guide my lessons. We were introduced to the Understanding by Design, the backwards design method, and I used that for every lesson that I planned. I started with, okay, what do I want the students to know at the end of this lesson? And from there, I would think of the objectives, the big question, and then I would say, how are they going to be assessed? How am I going to know that they learned the material? And then I would plan my activities accordingly. And I would always try and make my Just Do It activity engaging. I would try and engage their prior knowledge, make it fun for them, and connect to the activities, as well as having the closure activity connect back to the big question and the Just Do It. So this is a sample Smartboard presentation that I did when we were talking about the secession of South Carolina. I had the students look at this Wordle, and they had to write down why states was the biggest word. And this was great because for higher level kids, they could really take it to the next level. And then the lower level kids who sometimes struggled could state the obvious. States is the biggest word on there. Government is another big word. And so it really differentiated between the students and how each of them learned. I also had, I guess that doesn't work. I told them the objectives of the day, the big question. I always let them know what we were going to be doing that day. And then we took notes. I included lots of images. The kids love images. So I included a lot of images to give them good visuals. And then we did a map together on the states that seceded and the states that stayed in the Union. So it gave them a little bit of collaborative activity as well, being able to all be engaged together and talk about it together as a group. So found that lesson worked really well, and that the students were really involved because I was able to activate their knowledge, get them engaged, and differentiate that instruction as well. And so that was one of the areas that I felt that I really grew in throughout my experience. Another area was teaching effectively and engaging students. When you Google history in the images, this pops up as one of the images. History determined by the winners, born by the losers, slept through by students worldwide. I did not want to be that teacher. I did not want to be the teacher that kids wanted to sleep through their class, dreaded going to their class. But you know, when you're new at it, I didn't know what I was going to do to be able to effectively engage them and to get them excited about the material and into the material. One thing that I found really worked were frames. I did not like frames at the beginning of this year. I don't know why. I just didn't really like them. I didn't really believe that they could work, and I was shocked at the results. One of the first frames that I did was one of the first lessons that I ever taught, and it was a lesson on conflict. And the students together defined the word conflict to introduce them to the Civil War. And then I also ended with this lesson on defining Civil War broadly, not just the American Civil War. And they ate it up. They were so excited about it all. Everyone could collaborate together, they could work with their friends, and then we bring it around full circle and have everyone discuss it together and use the smart board to get everyone involved, have students come up to the board. And they really learned the material. Up until the last day that I was there, they were talking about conflict and how the Civil War was a huge conflict in American history. And they really enjoyed it. And this is my lesson on the meaning of conflict. So I started it by having them define or point out a conflict in a TV show, and then we watched a clip of Tom and Jerry depicting conflict in television. And that really engaged them. And I also saw again that the students gave the higher level students an opportunity to go for those more challenging answers than, and the lower level students could go for the more basic, like fighting. And you can tell the first key word that they came up with was conflict. So it just shows that they really do work, and I was impressed with that. I also used SCIMCs and other various processing sources for the students to really engage with the material and process the material. Because it's about the student, it's about tailoring instruction to the student. Another thing that also scared me was technology. Technology and I have a love-hate relationship. I feel like every time I really need it to work, it doesn't work. And every time I don't really need it, it does work. Luckily, it's working today, so I can be thankful for that. But if you had asked me 7 months ago, you can look back at my blogs and read what I wrote. I was not enthused about using technology in the classroom. I love to learn, but I felt like I could not learn technology. And I was surprised. I ended up using Quizlet, which is an online flashcard system. I used the Smartboard. I became very familiar with Smartboard, and a lot of other tools that I could use in the classroom that I knew added value and weren't just used for technology for the sake of technology. One lesson that I did my action research project on, was Google Earth. I started the lesson by activating their prior knowledge of what they knew about military vocab. My lesson was on the Civil War battles, which can be very boring and dry, and I wanted to gauge their knowledge, and what I had them do was write down what they thought were the answers to each of these vocab words, and then we collaborated, went over it together, and we came up with answers. The boys loved this because of their video gaming expertise. They knew a lot of the answers, and so it really engaged them in the material. And I used that to then go into my lecture on these Civil War battles. So this is an example of the Google Earth that I used. I created a tour of the major battles during the Civil War. They included images and just blurbs about what happened at those battles and why they were important. And the students, this really increased student interest and motivation in the classroom. They were excited to learn this material. I always struggled with military history, and so I had to research a lot of this to make it interesting for them and include enough stuff that would interest them, especially because I had some kids who were really, really, really into military strategy, which is not my thing. So I had to go and I researched for hours on how I was going to explain this and relate it to them. So technology is one area that I felt that I grew. Another area